Hello, and welcome to the webinar series focusing on social emotional learning. Before we begin, we're going to take just 30 seconds to do nothing. So get yourself into a comfortable position. Make sure that there are no distractions if at all possible. Make sure you're not writing anything, so put everything down. And let's start with just a cleansing breath, breathing in, filling up our lungs, expanding our bellies, and breathing out. And then let's do nothing for 30 seconds. Now, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on how just doing nothing for a short period of time might be beneficial to you as a teacher and also to your students. So if you want to write something down, take a moment and pause the video. Otherwise, just do a quick reflection. And we will circle back to this a little bit later on in today's webinar. Let's talk about social emotional learning. What is it? When you hear that term, what comes to mind? When we think about defining social emotional learning, really what this is it's a structure, it's a foundation of processes that helps us as both teachers or helps our students to develop some of the things that we fundamentally need, these competencies for emotions and for interactions with others and experiences and tools to really understand, to be able to name and to be able to manage our emotions as opposed to our emotions managing us, to be able to set our goals and then achieve them, to feel and show empathy for others, and then to also have compassion for ourselves, to establish and to maintain positive relationships because we need them to be successful in every aspect of life. And then finally, to make responsible decisions. So when we think about social and emotional learning in a classroom environment, what this really is it helps us to create a positive learning environment where our students can be successful both academically and socially and personally. So why do we even talk about this? Why is this important? Well, in a 2018 study, it was found that teenagers believe that both anxiety and depression, 70% of them believe that anxiety and depression is a major problem amongst their peers. We also know that when we look at suicide facts, that suicide is the leading cause of death for people ages 15 and up. And for those ages 10, for children ages 10 and up, suicide rates have increased at more than 50% in the last decade. We also know that 2 out of every 3 of our students has experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, also known as an ACE, and that 1 out of every 3 students has experienced more than one adverse childhood experience. And that when we look at the national statistics on child abuse, approximately 700,000 children are abused each year, and also noting that these are recorded incidents. So when we think about adversity, and especially childhood adversity and experiences, and those numbers that 1 out of 3 and 2 out of 3, this could be anything from abuse, neglect, divorce or separation of parents, parental domestic violence and the witnessing, child witnessing domestic violence, parents who have mental illness or are substance abusers, or a parent who is incarcerated. It also extends to community environments and the impact of trauma on children based on their communities. So, this could be poverty, racism, discrimination, community violence, lack of resources, or even homelessness or unaffordable housing. It can even go deeper into collective or historical traumatic experiences. So, genocide, slavery, mass incarceration, the Holocaust, or forced displacement. So, when we think about the impact that trauma has on brain development, it's important to recognize that brain development in early childhood really lays that foundation for future development because this is where those neural pathways are being formed. So, in regular development, in non trauma based development, what we find is that those neural pathways for cognition and adaptive behavior and emotional regulation, problem solving, positive attachment, and relationships are all being formed. Whereas when a brain is under developmental trauma, because of the things that we talked about in the last slide, what happens is that children then have trouble forming bonds and they have poor self regulation. They have persistent negative thoughts that they can't disabuse themselves of. They are hyper vigilant because they are in survival brain and not in learning brain. We know that trauma disrupts that attachment, it disrupts the cognitive development and emotional agency, and then also executive function. So, what is executive function? Well, this is a perfect graphic to really give you information as to that. So I'd like you to take a moment and pause the video and look at what is executive function, and then is executive function important for students, especially in a classroom setting? So pause the video and take your time as you read through this. So, as you looked at this graphic, I'm hoping that you came to the conclusion that executive function is important. And in a classroom setting, our students need to be able to access all of these things and to be able to perform all of these functions in order to be successful. But not just in a classroom setting, they need to be able to do this to be successful throughout their entire lives. So let's again return to this idea of what is social emotional learning. And I'd like to go a little bit deeper into it. So, when we think about the components of social emotional learning, we start off with this idea of being aware of ourselves, understanding our feelings and being able to label them, being able to recognize that many times our feelings are connected to our thoughts and then to our behaviors. Having a really accurate assessment of who we are and what our strengths are and what our challenges are, having that self efficacy and agency, and then having optimism. The second core component of social emotional learning is management, being able to have that control over our emotions instead of, as I said earlier, our emotions controlling us. Having the strategies and skills to effectively manage our stress, having that control and agency, being able to motivate ourselves, and then setting and achieving our goals. Then, once we move out of that self awareness and agency, we move into social awareness. So, that ability to recognize that the way that we see and experience things isn't universal. And so, having those different perspectives, being able to develop empathy for others, respecting and understanding diversity, understanding social and ethical norms of behavior and how that differs based on cultural norms, and then recognizing those who are supporting us. The next one is looking at relationships and having those relationship skills, being able to build relationships with people who may be very divergently different from us, being able to communicate cross culturally, to work cooperatively, and to seek help when we need it. And then finally, be able to make responsible decisions that benefit not only ourselves, but others. And recognizing that our own responsibility to behave in a way that takes into consideration others and understand and to be able to evaluate the consequences of our actions, both on ourselves and then collectively on society as a whole, recognizing our role as global citizens, and then being able to make those really positive and safe choices, not just for ourselves, but choices that impact our relationships with others and our goals, for immediate goals and then for our future. So I'd like to take a moment then and look at this brief introduction to social and emotional learning.
How many of you know a boy or girl here at school who gets picked on and left out and never included and laughed at all the time?
School can be a mean and dangerous
Raise
place,
your hands high, high.
evidenced by headline-grabbing tragedies and subtle daily slights.
Zena, why don't you shut up? Who cares what you think?
Fortunately, there is growing consensus that teaching social and emotional skills in school can make a difference.
We're going to use it as a tool to help us solve problems.
And there are a number of programs like Resolving Conflict Creatively that teach those skills.
The room and said, "You're going to wear those old rags to school?"
We are talking about a whole new vision of education that says that educating the heart is as important as educating the mind. And so it's about equipping young people with the kinds of skills they need to both identify and manage their emotions, to communicate those emotions effectively, and to resolve conflict nonviolently.
As part of a school-wide effort to create a positive environment, fourth graders at Brooklyn's PS 24 act as peace helpers, teaching younger students how to handle conflicts.
When the peace helpers were helping solve the conflict, what did you see the peace helpers do? I'm still learning because if I go to sixth grade next year, I need to learn how to control my anger because I have a serious temper problem.
Emotional intelligence is just a key human skill, but it also turns out that kids who are better able to manage their emotions, for example, actually can pay attention better, can take in information better, can remember better. In other words, it helps you learn better.
Benefits of social emotional learning programs include improved academic performance and attitudes towards school, a reduction in violence, bullying, and other negative behaviors, and an improved school environment for children and adults.
We're just seeing great behaviors. So,
as part of a district-wide mandate, schools in Anchorage, Alaska, have adopted comprehensive social emotional learning curriculum standards.
I'm a curriculum coordinator, so I am seen in the same office as the language arts coordinator, the math coordinator, the health coordinator, etc., to show just visually, politically, everything else that we are going to value this like we value any of our other curriculum. A lot of my job is to look at the already adopted curriculum and say, okay, here's a place where if I was teaching this reading lesson, I could also hit this social emotional learning centered at the same time.
What are some of the cool-headed thoughts you could have?
We're all under the gun to improve our test results, the academics, but it's a whole lot more fun to start focusing on on that connection with kids and helping people feel good about where they are, the other will follow. Our teachers, I think, are much happier. They like their kids.
Good job, kiddo. Excellent.
Practice being cool-headed this weekend.
There's research out now that shows that kids involved in intentional social emotional learning programs like we're trying to do right here scored on average 10% higher on their standardized tests. So what are we giving up? We're giving up higher referrals. We're giving up violence in our schools. What are we getting? Kids who come to school because they want to come to school, and kids who know how to act when they get into the schools, and hopefully kids who will go into their futures with a better chance of success.
I would like to keep on being friends.
Freeze. All right, yeah, nice job. For more information on what works in public education, go to edutopia.org.
All right, so as the video said, the research on social emotional learning has shown that students have an increase in academic outcomes and reduction in a risk of failure, which is so important. But also we know that as teachers, if we also have those skills and strategies, then we're more likely to be better teachers, to build relationships with our students, to have that empathy and patience that we really need, to have those stronger communication skills, and to create a safe learning environment. We also know that when we're skilled at having agency over our emotions, that we are less likely to burn out while teaching. So where do we even start with this? Well, let's start at the beginning. We have to really start with ourselves, and our students need to do the same thing. So we start with that self-awareness piece and the ability to recognize what our feelings are and to label them. And really this goes beyond kind of those basic feelings like I'm mad or I'm sad or I'm happy. So take a moment to look at this graphic because it's important to dial down to what that base emotion, what that true emotion is. Because if you say, I'm mad, when really what you are is hurt or frustrated, then you're not going to be able to, or your students aren't going to be able to truly address what's going on with them. So it's important that we begin to help our students understand feelings and be able to accurately label their feelings, and then to be able to talk about what can we do with them. So here are some examples of how you might address feelings in a classroom setting. So in an elementary setting, you might just identify some of the basic emotions to start with, and then begin to expand emotional vocabulary. And definitely with our secondary students, we want to go a little bit deeper as to what really is going on. So we can do that through visual representation, through charts, through having those discussions, through what we just looked at on the previous screen. We can, in an elementary classroom, use feeling jars for our students to take roll, and I'll show you a picture of that, or do emotional check-ins, and we can do emotional check-ins with all of our students, or ask them to reflect in a journal, or to reflect with a partner if they're comfortable. But when we start talking about these things out loud, we have to have that safe environment established in our classrooms in order for this to happen in an authentic way. We might use circle time. We definitely want to demonstrate that by sharing our own feelings and by being really metacognitive about that with our students. And if you're not familiar with restorative circles, that's a great place to really begin to deconstruct our feelings related to particular events or incidences that have happened in a classroom. We want to discuss behaviors that are connected to or related to feelings and those actions, and then maybe create some ways in which we might begin to work through those in a positive way. and even have our students create maybe personal coping skills plans or menus that they can use, with that understanding that one size doesn't fit all, that one strategy doesn't work for everyone. So we need to introduce a variety of different strategies. One of my former students, who is now a sixth grade teacher, takes role with emotional check-in jars. So every one of her students has a number and has a stick with that number on it. So at the beginning of the period, she lays out all of the sticks. As the students come in, they pick up the stick with their number and they put it number down in whichever one of the jars really speaks to how they're feeling at that time. And she said that when she first started this activity, that the students really were just kind of putting their sticks in whatever jar. And she said to them, the reason that we're doing this is because if I see that most of the sticks are in jars that indicate that you aren't really doing emotionally well or you're not feeling great, then we're not going to go right into learning because you're not in that headspace where you can learn. We're going to sit down and we're going to talk about what's going on. And what she found over time was that the students began to feel a little bit more comfortable, feel a little bit safer about putting their sticks in a jar that indicated how they were really feeling. And as they developed that self-awareness, they began to develop other awareness. And as she would check in with students in a very kind of private way, that she found that students were beginning to recognize when their peers weren't doing so well and begin to check in with them. And then over time, what she found was happening was that her students would approach her and say, we need a jar that says this, because none of the jars are really speaking to how I'm feeling today. So she found that she had to expand her jars and add other feelings for her students. So her students were beginning to grow in the way that they were identifying how they were feeling and moving forward with that. So I think that this is a wonderful idea of some things or something that you can do in a classroom setting. We can also use literature to start conversations about feelings and about approaching those feelings, identifying them, and things that we can do. So you see on the left-hand side of the screen some pictures that come from the We Are Teachers website, which I highly recommend, and some books that might be great for starting conversations with younger children. On the right side of the screen, you see books that are great for middle school students, secondary students that may start those conversations. So look for ways to incorporate literature in your classrooms to start those conversations. And then also keep in mind that a really great strategy for working with secondary students is to introduce them to some of the elementary level or younger level books with the idea of having them mentor younger students and have conversations with them. So you can introduce some of these strategies with your secondary students using really primary level books with the idea of having them mentor, but having these conversations where we're modeling conversations and discussions and what we might say to others, and note that they will be learning and growing personally as they prepare to be mentors for other students. All right. And then some other ways that social emotional learning can be integrated throughout the school day. Really helping students practice self-awareness by identifying how they feel, especially when they're confronted with difficult academic tasks. So taking a moment to stop and pause and check in with them, and then give them some strategies to move forward. Give them multiple opportunities for choice in what they might do as far as work or self-directed work or peer interactions. which allows them to really develop agency and responsible decision making, because we want to learn how to make good decisions in a safe environment. And we want to learn how to do that at a very young age, where the fallout from making a poor decision isn't as impactful as it is when we make poor decisions as adults. We also want to develop social and emotional competencies through lesson plans and through building that in to our curriculum and our content, as we saw in the video. And then we can help our students build better relationship skills, including communication, collaboration, problem solving, and listening, which is such a critical skill that very few of us possess, through structured group work. So when I say structured group work, it's not just putting students into a group and saying, do this, but by really teaching them how to communicate and how to collaborate, by helping them learn how to problem solve by role playing that, and then role playing listening, and giving students specific tasks within the group so that they can develop these leadership and competency skills. And then teach them that these SEL skills through those teachable moments by being, once again, metacognitive and guiding through your students through this by talking them through that, helping them to mediate conflict in those moments or checking in with them in those moments. And then finally, describing our own feelings and talking through the decision-making processes that we have in those contextual moments helps our students to do that. So often we do things that appear to be great ideas, but we don't talk our students through those automatic processes that we have. And that's really, really important. I grew up with a very metacognitive parent. In fact, I say that we learned how to drive when we were 2 years old because my mother talked through every mental process that she had. So if we were all in the car and she needed to change lanes, she would say, "Oh, I need to make a left-hand turn a little bit ahead. So I'm in the right-hand lane, so I need to move lanes. But before I move lanes, I need to make sure that nobody is in that lane. So I'm going to look in my mirrors to see if I see anyone. I'm going to turn and look over my shoulder just to make sure. And then I'm going to turn on my signal indicator so the people around me know what I'm about to do. And then I'm going to go ahead and move over so that I can be ready to make that left-hand turn." And so she did this with everything, and she talked through those processes. And as teachers and as parents, we need to definitely do that so that our students or the younger people in our lives can see how we make decisions and how we go through that mental and cognitive process. So another great strategy is to develop a personal plan. And I love this personal plan. This is free on the Indigo Dia site that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So take a quick picture of that with your camera. And they provide you with these two templates. The first one is coping strategies information, and it goes through all the different ways that we might cope with things. And it gives you some suggestions, a list of what those might be, and then the pros and cons of each. And then there's this blank template where you can write out your own distraction strategies, your own grounding strategies, your own emotional strategies, the ones that you will do, the ones that work best for you. Because again, we have to remember that even if it works for me, it's not going to work all of the time in every situation, and it's not going to work for everyone. So you personally are having your students come up with that personal way of identifying and then actionizing some of these strategies is very important because when we write it down and we practice it, we remember it. And then we're going to kind of go back to what we did at the onset of this webinar and think about why take a few minutes at the onstart of our day or at the beginning of each class session to just stop and to practice mindfulness. Well, we know from empirical studies that there are some very beneficial outcomes of practicing mindfulness, from our boosting of our immune system to increasing positive emotions, decreasing the negative, increasing the density of the gray matter in our brains, and who doesn't need that, improving focus and attention and memory, which we need as teachers, but our students most certainly need. We also um, reduce negative thought patterns, when our brain just kind of takes over and spins us into those thoughts that we can't get rid of. It reduces, we said, stress. It lowers our emotional reactivity. It increases our cognitive flexibility, which we need. It also helps us to modulate fear, to increase empathy and compassion, increase relationships, and overall have a better quality of life. So I recommend that we start each day or each class session, or for those of you who are teaching secondary, for at least our first class session of the day, with at least 30 seconds of doing nothing, all the way up to 5 minutes of mindfulness practice, because it helps us transition from whatever was going on into a mental space where we are ready to learn. And for us as teachers, it also helps us prepare mentally to do our best in our classrooms. So here are some things that I have done with all the way from kindergartners up to university level students. We did the do nothing reset. I love the idea of gratitude lists or journals, things that we can reflect back on when things aren't going really well. The 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique uses all of our senses to bring us into the present time and space. Breathing boards that you see, here's an example of one at the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, which make breathing more tangible for students who need something a little bit more concrete, who are visual spatial learners. They can trace while they are breathing, and breathing boards are free online. Just Google them, and there are all sorts of different structures of breathing boards, so you can incorporate them with younger students with learning shapes. With older students, you can just have them choose a breathing board that really resonates with them and use it. Making sure that you take those times within teaching to give your students a brain break and an opportunity to move, even if you're just having them stand in place and at their desk and do a think, pair, share. That's a movement, and that opportunity to talk to other people helps them to build relationships. And then for something, if we need to focus outside of ourselves, I love glitter jars or scent jars. You can just use a baby food container and then use essential oils and put them on a little napkin or cotton pad and put that in the jar and close that, because some people have sensitivity to things. So you want to close your scent jars. And then if a student needs to relax, then you have put in essential oils that are relaxing and calming, like lavender, and maybe they can pull that. Or if they need to be rejuvenated, you have other scent jars that have citrus scents that kind of help to energize them. So these are some ideas that you can use in your classroom and that you can teach your students to further these ideas of social emotional learning. So We also need to recognize, and we'll spend, you'll spend more time in the social emotional learning series, but we need to recognize that social emotional learning also isn't several things. It's not a way for you to control the behavior of your students or to reprogram them in some way to be better, to change their personalities, or to even impose your personal ideas of what might be an appropriate response to feelings or situations or events. It's none of those things. What it is a way to increase our conscientiousness and our understanding of ourselves and of others. It's a way to provide students with a platform that gives them voice and choice and agency to be successful, not just in that classroom setting, but to be successful throughout their entire lives. So, as we think of social emotional learning, it's important for you to also think about what else might you do in a classroom setting to make this happen. And then in closing, as a final thought, I'd like to reflect upon something that was said by the indelible Mr. Rogers, who was a practitioner of social emotional learning, social justice, and equity, and a supporter of children. And he said that anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. So I hope that you create an environment in your homes and personal spaces and in your professional spaces and classrooms where we can begin to incorporate social emotional learning, and where talking about our feelings and managing them in ways that are productive becomes something that is second nature. So, with this, I thank you for joining me on this journey where we're just learning more about ourselves and learning about how we can better serve our students. Have an amazing day.